Hello! Do you want to be able to do what I just did in that clip? Of course you do. So, I have one very simple goal in this video. I want to get you more kills in War Thunder Air RB. And to do that, I'm going to try to distill for you the game sense that I have gained after almost 4,000 hours playing fighters of every BR nation in this game, starting from the very basics of situational awareness, survival strategies, target prioritization, positioning, and how to aim. This is going to be more than just a list of tips and tricks. Instead, I want to provide you with a complete framework for understanding the flow of combat in ARB and how to navigate this environment to maximize your chances of scoring high kill games. And spoiler alert, there's more to it than just altitude. Now, because this is more of a beginner's guide, I'm going to be targeting my advice for battle ratings 6.3 and below, which isn't to say that this advice is useless in jets, but I'm not going to be going over the use of missiles or other advanced weapon systems, and also the general rules of thumb that I'm going to be providing are probably not going to be a good fit for 4th generation airframes. With all of that being said, this guide is going to focus heavily on game sense over mechanical skill, so there should be something here for you whether you're 220 or 200 hours into the game. If you're 2,000 hours into the game, maybe not so much, but I did try to make this as entertaining as I could. Okay, let's get to it. Step 0 is, of course, to pick a plane. Now, I've tried to keep the strategies in this video as general as I can, so they should work even if you're flying an off-meta plane, but especially if you're a beginner, there's no shame in trying to maximize your performance by picking the good ones. Now, it has been suggested that my own performance is due to my selective choice of aircraft, and while I don't necessarily agree with that assessment, if you want my picks, here's a handful of my favorite prop fighters in every nation in no particular order. Alright, so you picked your plane. Now let's talk about the early game. So here's where a lot of guides would go into detail about manual engine controls and optimal climb angles for your airframe, but that would take all day, and it's also just way too much information for you if you're a beginner, so just do this instead. Just try to maintain a 250 to 280 km per hour indicated airspeed. If you're going faster than this, pitch up a bit. If you're going slower, pitch down. This will get you pretty close to the optimal climb rate of most propeller planes. The other important thing to keep in mind is you do not want to be the first one into battle. Climb with your team, and make sure that there are at least a handful of teammates out in front of you so that they can spot the enemy first. You don't want to be the person who gets dogpiled by the entire enemy team while being 10 kilometers away from the nearest ally. As for how much you want to climb, we'll talk about that in detail later on. For now, let's discuss situational awareness. The key to situational awareness at any battle rating in War Thunder is the free look, so you need to have that bound to something extremely easily accessible. I have mine bound to spacebar. The second thing is you need to get really familiar with flying the plane with the keyboard while you're looking around with the mouse. So for me, I have my roll controls bound to A and D, my pitch controls bound to W and S, my yaw controls bound to Q and E, and my throttle bound to Shift and Control. That means I can fly the plane with the rest of my fingers while my thumb is pressing the free look button and my right hand is controlling the camera. But how do we actually use free look to our advantage? In essence, you need to turn your brain into a track while scan radar. I'll explain what I mean. So the first step is you need to be constantly looking around, 360 degrees above and below you. Anytime you're not actively maneuvering or lining up for a shot, you need to be checking your surroundings. Eventually, you will of course find an enemy. So what do we do now? First, we have to spend some time analyzing its trajectory. What direction is it facing? Where is it going? How fast is it going? Is it maneuvering? Using that information, we then have to make an extremely important judgment. Is this enemy an immediate threat? An enemy is an immediate threat if they're already actively attacking you, obviously, or if they're close enough to launch an effective attack on you if they so choose right this moment. In practice in props, this means any enemy that is within 3 kilometers above you or less than 1.5 kilometers below you, and especially if they're heading in your direction. Let's say this one is 5 kilometers away, approximately 2 kilometers below us, and heading in our general direction, but slowly. So definitely not a threat. What do? We keep scanning. With every new opponent that we find, we repeat this procedure. We first take a couple of seconds to analyze their trajectory and determine if they're an immediate threat. If they're not, then we continue our scan. Now this is the important part. For all the enemies that we've already seen before, we want to be continuing their trajectories in our mind and imagining where they'll end up, even when we can't actually see them in our field of view. Combining this with periodically checking back in on each enemy so that we can reevaluate it, we can use this method to maintain a full 360-degree picture of the battlefield around us, even though we can't look at all of it at all times. Now, this is a lot easier said than done when you're surrounded by a lot of enemies and under a lot of pressure, so if your head's starting to hurt, I'd suggest just start with the nearest 3. The more you practice, the better your brain will naturally get at it, and pretty soon you'll have this intuitive understanding of where enemies are expected to be, even when they're unspotted or out of your field of view. Here's an example from the intro clip. So I spot this J7W near my altitude, but at the same time I'm still trying to keep tabs on all the enemies below me. When I look back over, the J7W's name tag disappears. But because I have this mental model of what direction the J7W was going before I lost sight of it, I'm able to preemptively put myself in an offensive position and accurately predict where I need to be to attack it once it does reappear. And here's a couple more tips that I find can help improve my awareness in certain situations. First, keep the minimap in your peripheral vision and try to always be able to account for every red aircraft marker that is on it. If an enemy is spotted by the team, it'll automatically show up on the minimap when it gets close enough to you, even if you're not looking at it directly. Alternatively, if your pilot's awareness stat is high enough, enemies will automatically become spotted if they get close enough to you in certain circumstances. Now this can be very inconsistent and obviously should not be used as a replacement for actually looking around, but it's also saved me countless times from enemies that would have otherwise gotten the drop on me. The second thing is to just use your ears. If you hear an engine noise that is too loud or that you don't recognize, or of course if you hear bullets whizzing past your cockpit, you should probably check behind you. Okay, but now I'm getting ahead of myself. What do you do when an opponent actually is an imminent threat? Well, assuming you don't want to just sit there and take it, you have one of 3 options. 1, you can run away. 2, you can take evasive maneuvers and maybe try to counterattack. Or 3, you can take a head-on. Some of you are not going to like what I have to say next, but if you have the option, the safest choice is always to run away. Now, if we are running, the natural next question is, where do we run to? And the answer is toward your teammates. Now, contrary to popular belief, teammates are actually extremely useful in War Thunder, and it doesn't actually matter how good they are. Even the most selfish player in the world is not going to pass up the opportunity to shoot at a red name tag that is close to them. And because of that, I tend to treat teammates like the turrets in Balloon's tower defense, in the sense that if you're near a teammate, it's going to be harder for the opponent to attack you because the teammate might attack them, especially if you end up baiting the opponent into a really easy shot for the teammate. There are a couple really simple ways that you can make the enemy a lot easier for your team to deal with. Number 1, you can drag them low by diving. This also helps you get away from the enemy because diving helps you pick up speed. Number 2, when you get close, try to turn perpendicular to your teammates instead of going straight at them. This gives them the best opportunity to get a shot on the enemy if the enemy decides to follow you into that turn. Now, sometimes you just can't get away from the opponent. Maybe they're too fast, maybe they have too much of an altitude advantage. In that case, you will have to take evasive maneuvers. I do already have a guide for how I approach defensive flying in War Thunder RRB up on my channel. I'll leave that in the description if you want to take a look at it. But to really oversimplify, what you're trying to do is you're trying to slow down as fast as possible while avoiding the opponent's guns until they overshoot, at which point you can try to run away again, or you can try to win the dogfight. Dogfighting itself is obviously a very deep topic and not something that I'm going to go into in this video, but one thing I will say about dogfighting is if your objective is purely to get as many kills as possible, you should actually avoid them. One, when you're dogfighting, you're vulnerable, so you could get jumped by a third party at any point. And two, even if that doesn't happen, spending time in a dogfight means you're not spending that time going after easier targets, which would be easier kills. As for taking head-ons, the standard advice for newer players is don't, and I do tend to agree, if only so that you get more opportunities to hone your dogfighting skills. But there are situations where it is the only option, like if you're in a 3v1 and the only way to even the odds is to take a few risky head-ons, well, it's that or die, so sometimes you gotta do it. With that being said, it should be your last resort, because if you have any advantage at all over your opponent, you're throwing it away by taking the head-on. Now, with all this talk of running away, there's one very important caveat that you need to keep in mind, which is if there are no teammates left to run to, you absolutely should go down fighting. There's no point in just dragging out the match by running and running and running. It's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of everybody else's time. And frankly, you'd be better off just crashing the plane and going back to the hangar if you wanted to be that petty about it. Incidentally, if you're backed into a corner like this, that is an excellent opportunity for you to practice your head-ons. Alright, before we move on, let's walk through a quick example of all three of these evasive options in context. Now, at the start of the match, I pretty much just do what I explained earlier. The bowfighter gets an air spawn, and it spawns pretty far ahead of the rest of the team, so I'm converting this extra energy that I have into altitude and just slowing down so that I can wait for the team to catch up. I briefly consider going for this B-25 that flies underneath me, but it's too early in the match, and I'm not comfortable losing all of my altitude just yet, so I just let it pass. As you can see, some of the teammates have rushed ahead now, and this is why it's beneficial to let your teammates go first, because now I'm starting to be able to see where the enemies are as the teammates are spotting them without being spotted myself. Then I spot this second B-25, and at this point I'm going to let the clip resume at regular speed. This B-25 is actually higher than me, unlike the last one, so going for it is not going to make me lose energy. Also, as I'm watching, it takes a swipe at our P-8, so I decide it's my responsibility to punish this bomber-on-bomber violence. At the same time, though, notice that there is this large column of enemy fighters that is being spotted over to the left. While they're not an immediate threat, they are coming very decidedly in my direction, and very soon they will become a problem, so I am on a timer here. Thankfully, to my right, I have my own column of friendly fighters that is heading in my direction, so my plan here is to try to thread the needle, pluck this B-25 out of the air, and then immediately retreat behind the safety of my fighters. Now, this B-25 is actually playing really aggressively and turning into our team, which I didn't really expect, but now it's lining up for a head-on with me, and as we discussed before, I have other options, so I'm not going to take this head-on. In the heat of the moment, I make this split-second decision to turn under the B-25 and give chase, but this ends up extending the amount of time that I'm spending on the front line, which gives the enemy fighters a chance to catch up with me. Now, unfortunately, my aim is a bit off, and I only set a couple of fires. The B-25 is going to be able to put those out, and in the meantime, I have much bigger problems. I make a mad dash for my teammates immediately, but as I look behind me, my fears are confirmed. There are now 4 enemies on my 6, and they are all within 3 kilometers of me. Now, for those of you who've flown the Bowfighter before, you know that this is not a very fast plane. So my only hope now is for these enemies to become distracted by my teammates so that I get a chance to reposition. And my gamble seems to have paid off for the most part, except for this minor detail that this Yak 3 has slipped through my teammates and is still rapidly gaining on me. Now, in this situation, I kind of only have one option. There definitely isn't enough room for me to turn this thing around and try to go for a head-on, and running away, well, I'm not sure I can even gain enough speed in a dive to get away before the yak catches up to me, and even if I could, I'm not really convinced that the bullfighter is actually faster than the yak. Probably not. And so that means...
Then it's a dogfight.
Against a Yak 3.
Yeah, we'd still have a chance.
In a Bullfighter Mark 21.
It's not the plane, sir. It's the pilot.
And that's why you just gotta resist the urge to take that head on, man. It's not worth it. Alright, okay. We're like 18 minutes into a video that is allegedly about getting kills, and so far all I've talked about is running away. Well, thank you for your patience, but now let's get on to the good stuff. Now that you know how to stay alive, let's talk about picking your targets. Now, if we're only thinking about individual targets in isolation, the best target boils down to the one that is easiest to get to. However, this isn't always the target that is closest to your plane. Remember, aircraft go faster in a dive than they do in a climb, and it's easier to go somewhere that is already in front of you than it is to have to turn first. What this means in practice is you're looking for a target that is in your forward hemisphere so that you don't have to turn around to engage it, and somewhere within 1 to 2 kilometers below you so you'd have a substantial energy advantage without having to sacrifice a ton of altitude to properly engage it. Preferably, the target should also be within 5 kilometers so it doesn't take too long to reach their position. In the same vein, enemies that are moving in your direction or perpendicular to you make better targets than enemies that are already running away from you, because those will take longer to chase down. Also keep in mind that all the rules of thumb from the previous section still apply, so if an enemy is above you or only slightly below you, they are probably going to fight back, or they might even be the one to attack first. Your overall goal is to find the easiest possible targets and minimize the amount of time that you're spending on each target so you can maximize your killing potential. Now, with all that in mind, you might have already figured out where the complexity comes in. Because, in order to be efficient at racking up kills, it's not enough to just be able to pick the single best target at any point in time. You need to be able to come up with a game plan to take out multiple targets in sequence. That means, yes, for all of you computer science nerds out there, War Thunder ARB is a traveling salesman problem. But don't worry, this isn't an algorithms course, and I do have some easy rules of thumb for approaching this multi-target selection problem. So starting with picking individual enemies like we just discussed, level 1 is adding back in situational awareness. You don't want to just go blindly attacking the nearest enemy to you at any given time, because you might put yourself in a bad situation. You gotta keep in mind where all the other opponents are and avoid putting yourself in a position where multiple enemies can counterattack at the same time, because that situation is one that you likely won't survive. In practice, this just means looking for enemies that have separated themselves from their teammates enough to give you the opportunity to attack them for free. A good example of this is this B-25 from the Bullfighter clip. It was far enough ahead of its team that I was able to take a couple of swipes at it before the teammates caught up and I had to run away. Similarly, you should always work your way down from high to low altitude when picking off individual enemies. This is because it's hard for your opponent's teammates to support them if they have to climb up to your altitude in order to do so. and if they try, that makes them an easy target for you as well. Just don't hesitate too much to ditch that altitude if you need to get away from enemies that are above you, because remember, your survival is always your top priority. Building on top of that, level 1.5 would be keeping in mind the opportunity cost of attacking the enemy. Basically, is it worth my time to actually chase them down in order to get the shot? This is why I generally don't advise going for bombers at the beginning of the game, because while they're often very easy targets, spending the time to chase them down puts you so far from the action that it often is really hard for you to even do anything for the rest of the game. And that's assuming you don't just get shot down by the backgunners, which is always incredibly embarrassing. The same goes for any enemy that's playing really passive and just running away at high altitude. If there are any other targets around, you'll be much better off spending your time fighting somebody who actually wants to play the game. Jokes aside, this is also why running away is a good strategy for staying alive, even if the enemy can technically catch up to you eventually. If you waste their time hard enough, it's actually in their best interest to go fight somebody else. Now level 2 is putting teammates back into the equation. We already know how to use teammates as a defensive option from the previous section, but now we're going to turn that on its head. If you see a teammate or a group of teammates that are losing a fight, that's an opportunity for you to swoop in and pick up some easy kills while the enemies are distracted. On the other hand, if you see an enemy that's already being dogpiled by like 3 teammates, it's probably worth looking for a different target because it's very unlikely that you'll be the one to pick up the kill for this one. Not to mention the fact that you might get team killed for quote-unquote kill stealing if you do. And here's an example of that first scenario. So I see that this Yak 3U and this Yak 15 are both attacking our Corsair, and I'm in an AM1, so usually I wouldn't have much of a chance of getting a shot on either of these opponents considering how nimble they are, but they're so incredibly tunnel visioned on my teammate that I just swoop in and click them both out of the air. Now unfortunately I'm not in time to save my teammate, and also another teammate had the same idea as me and I end up stealing their kill by accident, but at least it looks cinematic. And finally, level 3 is multi-target selection. So looking for opportunities to kill multiple targets one after the other, maybe even in the same pass. What you want to do here is look for clusters of enemies that are close to each other, below you, and preferably distracted so you have multiple opportunities to attack before they figure out what's going on. Your job here is to first take a moment to analyze the flow of the furball and determine what the optimal order to attack each enemy is. You need to identify the enemies that currently have the least amount of pressure on them put on by your teammates and eliminate them first. In practice, there is often a chain of attack where an enemy is being engaged by a friendly, which is in turn being engaged by another enemy, etc., all the way until you find an enemy that isn't being engaged by a friendly. This is where you want to start your own attack, working your way up the chain until all the enemies have been eliminated. And if you're lucky, the enemies might be so tunnel visioned on your teammates that they'll line themselves up for you, like in the intro clip, which is a pretty textbook example of this. Now this isn't a strategy that you can use consistently because it does require the enemy to sort of play along, but you can increase the chance of this sort of thing happening with strategic positioning. So now is our chance to discuss side climbing and whether it's actually worth doing in the first place. Now regardless of what climb path you actually take at the beginning of the game, you should always be climbing at that optimal climb speed of about 250 to 280 kilometers an hour. As a reminder, rushing out ahead of your team puts you at a huge disadvantage because you haven't spotted any of the enemies yet, so you don't know where they are, but the instant an enemy spots you, the entire enemy team knows where you are. So with that in mind, this leaves us with just one choice to make at the beginning of the game, and that is what direction to climb in. For those of you who aren't familiar, side climbing is just climbing in a direction that isn't directly at the enemy so that you give yourself more time to climb before you have to fight. The trade-off goes like this. If you don't side climb, you're risking other planes that have better climb rates than you to be above you when you meet them. If you do side climb, you're increasing the chances that you'll be above the enemy when you run into them, but you're trading that for the opportunity cost of not being able to participate in the early game. Now keep in mind, there is no optimal way of making this decision. I think it's more down to personal preference and how much risk you're willing to take. But for beginners, here's a few suggestions to get you started while you're finding those preferences. If you're in a plane that already climbs really well for its battle rating, such as a Bf-109 or a Spitfire, side climbing doesn't benefit you that much because you're already likely to be above the enemy to begin with. Alternatively, if your plane uses its maneuverability as its primary advantage rather than speed, such as an A6M0 or a Kai 43, side climbing isn't that useful for you either because having a huge altitude advantage over your opponent doesn't help you that much. On the other hand, if your plane's advantage is its speed, but it doesn't have a fantastic climb rate, which is the case for a lot of American fighters, side climbing is almost mandatory because otherwise you won't be able to use your airframe to its advantages. Also, if you have a plane with an air spawn, it's good to side climb at least a little bit just to give your team time to catch up so that you aren't the first one into battle. If you don't know your plane very well, just try climbing with the team and see how things go. If you're constantly feeling like you need more altitude to be effective, then try side climbing a little bit. On the other hand, if by the time you reach combat, it feels like all the teammates are either already dead or have killed all the enemies and there's nothing left for you, then you're probably side climbing too much. Remember, at the end of the day, you do not need to be above the entire enemy team. You only need to be above enough of them to have the opportunity to score some kills. One final thing to note is that side climbing is not just something you can do at the beginning of the match. In the middle or toward the end of a match when you're in between fights, it's often good to take a bit of time to regain some altitude so you have better options when you meet your next batch of enemies. Okay, that was a lot of information. So I think this is a good spot to pause and do a little recap. Your first priority is always survival. You can't get kills if you're dead. So that means keeping that head on a swivel, maintaining situational awareness, and ensuring that you have a game plan to counter any threats in your vicinity. Make sure to keep tabs on where your teammates are at all times so you know where you can run to. Next, you want to position yourself so that there are as many enemies as possible below and in front of you. You can use side climbing to gain altitude in order to put more enemies underneath you and increase your options. Once you're here, your job is to look for groups of distracted or otherwise vulnerable enemies. So this could be a furball, an ally that is under attack, or just an enemy that's isolated itself from the pack. Make sure to prioritize enemies that are not currently under attack by your own allies, and try to look for attack chains that you can exploit in order to get multi-kills, remembering to work your way down from high to low altitude whenever possible. All right, did you get all that? Because we are so very close to done. We've talked about how to survive, how to pick your targets, and how to position yourself to increase your chances of having good targets to pick. There's only one piece left to finish off the equation, and that's actually pressing the trigger, or what I like to call the AAA method. Is this a reference to batteries, beef, or airfield defenses? I'll let you be the judge of that one. What matters is what it represents, which is a mental workflow for how to shoot down your enemy. The first A stands for approach. This is the phase where you've chosen your target and you're figuring out how to get close enough in order to take your shot. The second A stands for aim. This is when you've gotten into gun range and you're trying to get your shots on target while reacting to any evasive maneuvers that the opponent is performing. The third A stands for avoid. After the attack is finished, you need to avoid any counterattacks from the opponent's teammates and also any follow-up shots from the opponent themselves if they're still kicking. Now, trying to go over every single way of attacking an opponent in air combat would probably have us here for literal days. So for both of our benefits, I'm going to focus on booming and zooming. The boom and zoom, in my opinion, is the easiest attack to execute, so it's good for beginners. But don't let that simplicity fool you. It's also one of the most effective ways of leveraging an altitude advantage. And unlike some other air combat maneuvers, it's something that you can pull off in pretty much any plane, so it's always worth at least considering. Let's talk about it, starting with the approach. So once you've picked your target, your next objective is simple. You need to get close enough to pull the trigger. If you have an altitude advantage over your target, all you have to do is dive toward it. However, and this is the important part, do not just stare salivating at the target that you've picked. The battlefield situation is constantly changing, and so you need to be constantly updating your situational awareness. Are there any other enemies nearby? Do any of them pose a threat to you? Alternatively, are any of them presenting themselves as a better target than the one that you're currently going for? Remember, you're not glued to your target. You can always switch. Also, you gotta keep track of where your teammates are, especially anyone that's going for the same target as you, because that is a recipe for a mid-air collision or a friendly fire incident. Finally, you have to keep track of your own speed. Having a lot of speed is good for getting away after you've finished your attack. However, it's not so good for getting your guns on target because it gets really hard to control your plane past a certain point. And that's assuming your plane doesn't just fall apart outright. If you notice the wings on your plane shaking or the speedometer turning red, you need to pull out of that dive immediately unless you want to turn into an improvised bomb. If you're in a situation where you know you need to dive a really long distance, throttle down early so that you have longer to fall before you lock up or overspeed. By the way, this is the so-called boom part of the boom and zoom. So congrats, you've made it into gun range. But hold on, what even is gun range to begin with? The full answer to this question is a bit nuanced because it depends on what guns you're shooting, where they're placed on your plane, what your convergence is, and also just how confident of a shot you are in the first place. But this video is full of general rules of thumb anyway, so here's another one for you. If you're in a tail chase, don't shoot until you're within about 500 meters. If you're shooting side on, you can try starting at about 700 meters. As for gun convergence, there's two settings, the convergence distance and also whether or not you're using vertical targeting. The distance just sets where in front of your plane all of your guns are pointed at. So for something like the early Spitfire that has 8 machine guns that are spread across both of its wings, if you set the convergence to 400 meters, then all of the bullets will converge at a point 400 meters in front of your plane. So that is the distance where theoretically you will be doing the most damage. As for vertical targeting, this is just compensating for bullet drop. So if you have vertical targeting on, then the guns will be pitched up ever so slightly so that the effective bullet drop at the convergence point is 0. I tend to leave this setting off because I prefer compensating for bullet drop myself. As for the actual convergence setting, I tend to have mine set to 400 meters for wing-mounted machine guns, 500 meters for wing-mounted cannons, and 600 meters for everything else, although your mileage may vary because this does depend on how early or how late you prefer to open fire. Which is an excellent segue to how to actually hit your target when you press the trigger. Now, aiming in War Thunder is a very deep topic because it essentially requires you to understand player behavior and psychology so that you can predict your opponent's movements. And that's definitely too much to get into in this video. However, if you're a beginner or me, sometimes it's hard to even hit a target that's flying in a straight line. So with that in mind, I do have a few basic tips to help you get over that initial hurdle. If you're above the enemy that you're firing at, aim above it. If you are below the enemy that you are firing at, aim below it. If you are extremely close to the enemy that you're trying to shoot at, think under 100 meters, aim higher above it than you think you need to compensate for parallax. If you don't know what parallax is, don't worry about it, just aim up a little bit. Now this might be a bit controversial, but I do not recommend tap firing in most situations. It ruins any element of surprise that you had because the opponent will inevitably start to freak out when they see tracers raining all around them, and also it doesn't give you any useful feedback for adjusting your aim because if you have some bursts hitting at random and others not, you have no idea whether you're underleading or overleading. Finally, I can't tell you how many times that I've tried tap firing to conserve ammo, only to have an opponent fly through my line of fire because I stopped firing at exactly the wrong moment. It's not worth it. Instead, always give your trigger a solid squeeze, and if you have limited ammunition or your guns overheat easily, just be more mindful about what shots are even worth taking in the first place. And finally, if you're lining up for a side-on shot, always give it like twice as much lead as you think you need to. If you lead too far, you can just wait for the target to run into your bullets, But if you lead too little, a lot of the time you're going to miss the shot, because even if you try to compensate, at that point your plane won't be able to pull hard enough. Okay, we're going to take a step back here. The aim part of the AAA method doesn't just refer to the mechanical act of aiming. Rather, it represents the part of the attack where you are mentally entirely focused on shooting down your target. And this is the riskiest part of the gameplay loop to be in, because even if you're an experienced player, you're still going to have your situational awareness drastically reduced. And if you start a dogfight, well, you're essentially extending this period of reduced awareness for even longer. Your goal, especially as a beginner, should be to reduce the amount of time that you spend in this aim stage and move on to the next stage as quickly as possible so you can regain your situational awareness. The boom and zoom technique is tailor-made for this. If your target does a defensive maneuver that you don't know how to counter, or if you're simply coming in at a bad angle and you can't get the shot, well, just disengage. Pull that nose back up, convert that speed back into altitude, and reset for a fresh attack. This is the zoom part of booming and zooming. Very straightforward in principle, but there is a catch. You see, if you just fly away in a straight line, any experienced player is just going to immediately beam you out of the air. Does this mean booming and zooming is a bad strategy? Of course not. You just have to be a bit more clever with it. What booming and zooming guarantees is that your opponent isn't going to be able to catch you in the climb because you have so much more speed. However, that doesn't stop them from pointing their nose at you and taking a few shots as you leave. So, your job while you are disengaging is to avoid your opponent's line of fire until either they give up or they run out of energy and just fall out of the sky. If your opponent is particularly stubborn in trying to chase you, you can perform what is called an energy trap. Climb in a wide spiral to make the opponent lose their speed faster while avoiding their guns, and once the opponent drops their nose, you can boom back down on top of them for a very easy shot since they'll be going extremely slowly. Timing the actual rollover does require a bit of practice, but at the very least you'll avoid the opponent's guns. This works the same against multiple opponents if all of them are below you, because none of them are going to be able to catch you in your climb, so it's kind of the same situation anyway. You just might have to dodge a few more bullets. However, inevitably, you will find opponents that are above you when you're trying to disengage from your target. In this situation, losing all of your speed in a climb is a very bad idea because you'd be leaving yourself extremely vulnerable. Instead, you want to keep your speed and either run towards your team or whatever direction has the fewest enemies so that you have the best chance of escape. If you're in a particularly fast plane for your lobby, this works especially well because you'll be able to maintain your speed for longer than your opponents will. In fact, storing your energy as speed rather than altitude is one of the key differences between jet and prop combat. When you're running away horizontally like this, it's good to make small negative G adjustments to your flight path in order to screw up the opponent's aim. You'd be surprised at how often the opponent will completely whiff their shots when you do this, especially if they're directly behind you. So that pretty much covers all three phases of the AAA method as it relates to the tactic of booming and zooming. Now I should mention that the AAA method itself is not a specific tactic, but more of a general framework for understanding your mental state when you're performing any kind of attack in air combat. I've been using general language where I can so that you can try to apply this workflow to techniques outside of booming and zooming as well. But if I haven't lost you already, I'm pretty sure I will if I start going into alternatives to booming and zooming at the 40-minute mark of what is supposed to be a beginner's guide. So instead, I'll just go over one basic air combat maneuver that'll help you get back on target a little bit quicker. Think of it as dipping a pinky toe into the ocean that is dogfighting. So picture this. You're diving toward your opponent and you take the shot. Unfortunately, you miss, and now they're alerted, so they turn underneath you to try to avoid you. How do you press the attack in this situation? If you're purely booming and zooming, the answer is you don't. You climb back up to altitude and you reassess the situation. But this is too slow. We want to get our kill before a teammate comes in and snags it from us. So can we just follow the opponent's turn? Absolutely not. We're going way too fast. We're going to pancake into the ground if we try. It doesn't matter how nimble our airframe is. It's not going to happen. We need to slow down first. So instead of chasing after the opponent directly, first we put our plane into a steep climb to shed the excess speed. Once we're slow enough to maneuver again, we simply point the nose back toward the target and dive back down immediately. This essentially fuses multiple boom and zoom attacks into one long attack that you can extend as you need. The specific maneuver is called a high yo-yo. Technically more of a loop-de-loop in this case because the target ended up going back in the same direction, but it's the same idea. The high yo-yo can also be used to improve your angle before committing to an attack, especially if you're coming in way too fast initially. Each loop allows you to bleed a little bit of speed in a controlled way while maintaining enough speed to react to any unexpected maneuvers from your target or from any other opponents in the area. The tighter you make your loops, the more speed you'll bleed. So in this example, I'm helping my squad mate with this MiG-17, but it keeps turning underneath me and making it awkward for me to actually dive on it, so I do a sequence of high yo-yos to improve my position and also reduce my speed by just a little bit so I have better control of my plane before I take the shot. Now note that I'm only able to do this because there's no other enemies in the area, so I can focus my efforts entirely on this one target. Chaining these high yo-yos puts you solidly in the aim stage of the AAA method, and remember, we want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And that is pretty much everything. We've covered situational awareness, survival strategies, how to position, how to pick your targets, and now how to shoot them down. That's the ARB gameplay loop in a nutshell. Let's cap it all off in context with a play-by-play breakdown of this recent ace game that I got in the BF-49K4 using each of these strategies. Just gonna pause here to talk about my loadout. So I do like to take the 20mm on the K4. Sometimes I take the 30, but I find the 20 is a lot easier to aim and you get more trigger time. I'm using the air targets belt to maximize the amount of mine shells, and I'm also taking universal on the 13mm to give me a bit more tracer since the air target belt on the 20mm has very little tracers. Gun convergence is set to 600 meters because all the guns are in the nose, and I'm taking 20 minutes of fuel because 109s do burn their fuel faster when using war emergency power. With the engine upgrades, the K4 climbs like a rocket ship, so I am not concerned about side climbing whatsoever. As you can see, I'm just climbing straight at the enemy. This particular game was also a bit of a joint in progress, so I did start out a good 6 kilometers behind the rest of my team. Now, a lot of players consider this to be a disadvantage because you're missing out on time for climbing, and you can turn joint in progress off in the settings if you don't like it, but personally, I don't mind it because, especially in situations like this, it allows you to be a lot more confident in your initial climb path because you know you have this buffer between you and any potential enemies. Now, as I'm approaching 5,000 meters of altitude, my brain-rotted attention span gets the better of me, and I start browsing the in-game achievements instead of actually paying attention to my surroundings. And while I definitely don't recommend this as a strategy, I do have an explanation. From experience, I know most players don't tend to climb above 5,000 meters even if their airframe allows it, which at this battle rating is pretty much just Spitfires anyway, and if I meet a Spitfire or two at altitude, I can always just dive early to avoid their attention, and I'm confident that there will still be plenty of targets below me for me to engage in the early game. Pretty soon I'm at 6,000 meters, and at this point a lot of enemies have been spotted by my team, and there's enough red name tags underneath me that it convinces me to finally stop screwing around with the achievements tab and actually try to pick a target. Now immediately my multi-target selection spidey senses are tingling because there is so much red underneath me. I know there's the potential for a multi-kill, but I gotta get in there first. I decided to start with the Spitfire directly underneath me, mostly because it's just the closest target, but also I see it turning after our friendly HE-162, so the pilot is probably distracted. I throttle off of WEP as I invert to start the dive, and because of how steep this dive is, I quickly throttle all the way down to 0. In the meantime, I take the opportunity to do another scan of my surroundings to make sure that no enemies have escaped my attention. And the next group of enemies is quite a ways away, so I feel pretty confident that I will not be disturbed while I execute my attack. Now here, an A6M5 joins the party on the HE162, and for a moment I think there's the opportunity for me to gun them both down in one pass, but unfortunately I'm just a couple of seconds too late. But that's okay, we keep going for the Spitfire, we finish our attack, and then we regain altitude to reassess the situation. Still no enemies above me or around me, and the 0 is the closest enemy to me, so following the principles of single target selection, I simply dive back down and chase after it. This pilot definitely notices me, and they want me to know that because they pop smoke. Now, smoke can sometimes be used to signal surrender, but in this particular case, I think it's more of a waving a red flag in front of a bull type of situation. I do my best to take a shot, but I whiff, and now the 0 is very clearly trying to bait me into a dogfight that I can't possibly win, so instead of playing along, I simply maintain my speed to zoom out of danger, and toward the next nearest group of enemies where I can continue my attack. Now I have a massive energy advantage over these guys, but they are outnumbering me, so I need to be careful. You can see me briefly angle for a spiral climb here in case any of them decides to pitch for me, but they don't seem to be paying attention to me, so instead I convert that into an extremely aggressive high yo-yo and slot in behind this Corsair. This Spitfire notices me and tries to pull in for a head-on, but because I'm going so much faster, it's very easy for me to just pitch up and avoid the nose. And now we're transitioning from aim to avoid as I use my speed to get away from the rest of these enemies. Now here's a great example of how effective running away is as a strategy. Both of these Spitfires, if they wanted to, could probably reel me in because I did lose a lot of energy with my aggressive maneuvering earlier, but my teammates are both an easier target and a bigger threat right now, so they both break off, which allows me to maintain my altitude advantage. Now as I dive back in to start my third attack, I'm going to pause the footage because this is the most complicated situation of this particular game. There are 3 enemies in front of me that are all presenting themselves as easy targets because they're all slow and facing away from me. However, there's no obvious way to chain an attack between any of them, so I'm going to have to just pick one. At the same time, there's now this Corsair in front of me that's both above me and rapidly heading in my direction, so there's also an immediate threat in the picture. Now there is this friendly Spitfire in between me and the Corsair that is both an easier and more obvious target than I am, so I am betting that the Corsair is going to go for that, but that's not guaranteed of course. So here if I was playing it safer, I would probably have turned perpendicular to delay my approach until I was sure that the Corsair wasn't gunning for me, but in this moment I see that the Spitfire, which is a Spitfire LF Mark 9, one of the most ridiculous planes at this battle rating, is in an extremely vulnerable state at the top of a loop. I'm probably not going to be able to get a chance like this again, so I decide to go for it. Now I should note that if the Corsair decides to go for me last minute, I do still have the final defensive option of trying to barrel roll around its guns, but that's an extremely high risk gamble because at that point I'm just betting against the opponent's aim, so we'll just have to see how it works out for me. And just like that, it seems like the situation has turned massively in my favor, mostly due to the fact that these guys just didn't see me coming. So this Spitfire underneath me is way too slow to turn after me before I'm long gone, and as for the Corsair, well, I guess it wouldn't be a YouTube video without a paid actor moment, so thank you for your service. I take a quick glance behind me as I'm zooming back out, and both of these guys are going way too slow, so I'm just going to ignore them for now. Looking over to my right, though, there's a new contender approaching. That is a clipped-wing Griffin Spitfire at altitude, which is very scary. But as I watch its flight path, it's pretty clearly going for my teammate instead of me, which in a vacuum might be the right choice because the Spitfire is harder to dogfight than a Bf-109. But if you're not going to put pressure on me, I'm just going to keep abusing my speed against your teammates, so back in I go for attack number 4. Now, I do go for a quick head-on here, but at this distance, it's pretty low risk for me because I have more than enough time to dodge any return fire. In the meantime, the 0 finally goes down to my teammate, which means my next priority is that Spitfire above me. Now what happens next kind of feels like another paid actor moment, but I think I can explain it. The pilot probably just screwed up their initial pass, and instead of having the patience to go for a proper reset and boom and zoom, they just decided to flat turn to try to get a shot as quickly as possible, but I guess they just forgot that I existed because they end up turning directly into my guns. And that's my ace. You can see me still looking around frantically because I'm still paranoid that I'm about to get jumped, but as it turns out, the last player on their team was just an A26 that went back to base, so I pop a blind hunt order and go put them out of their misery. And I can already hear the comments screaming. That was the most low-skill gameplay of all time. You literally didn't even do anything. All you did was look around and fly in circles, and the enemy literally just tripped and fell into your guns. And you know what? Yes. That is precisely the point that I'm trying to make with this video. If you know how to boom and zoom, have halfway decent aim, and you have good situational awareness and target prioritization, you are going to mop the floor with conservatively 60% of lobbies, if not more. Now, don't get me wrong. You need mountains of mechanical skill to be good at dogfighting. And if you end up in a dogfight with anybody with only the skills that I taught in this video, you're probably going to die. But guess what? You don't need to know how to dogfight to absolutely demolish teams in RRB. Should you learn how to dogfight? Of course, it's fun, and there's tons of resources on YouTube and elsewhere to help you learn. But I also know that War Thunder can seem like this insurmountable cliff of an initial learning curve, and I'm here to tell you that it's not as complicated as people often make it out to be. You don't need to know any BFM. You don't even need to know what BFM means to top the leaderboards in War Thunder RRB. And I just know this is going to piss off the sim jockeys so much. But unfortunately, it's also the truth. Okay, look, if you've made it this far, thank you. I hope the video has been entertaining, first of all, but also that it's helped persuade you that game sense does trump mechanical skill when it comes to performing well in War Thunder air realistic battles, at least when you're first starting out. For those of you who are interested in learning about dogfighting or other mechanical skills, I've linked a few videos that I think are very good in the description of this video. And also, I've linked a few of the tutorials that I personally watched back in 2015 when I was first starting out. I just think it's fun to see how far the game has come in all these years. And there's just something nostalgic about these older videos. And with that, that's the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Wait, hold on. Where's the where are the end cards? Where's the logo? Oh, come on. No, I'm over it. I'm over it. Okay? We're not doing this. I'm over it. Like it was just 2 or 3 comments ago. It's not a big deal. just forget about it. Be the bigger person. Be the big person. It's one thing to say that, you know, all my enemies are bad or I'm just getting lucky cuz that's fine. Like I can get over that. It's just, you know, if all my enemies are bad, then everybody must be bad. And if everybody's bad, then all you got to do is be better than the bad people. So that's fine. That's just whatever. And if I'm lucky, well, I guess I'm luckier than other people. And if I can make my own luck, that's got to count for something, right? Yeah. But then there's this. You're telling me the only reason that I'm doing well in War Thunder is because I'm playing the Yak 3U? Really? Really?